Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Erica Lukes, happy to be here, and I will say that I missed all of you last week. But as some of you have gathered, I've been going through things in my personal life that have taken a toll, most definitely. And every once in a while, a girl needs to hide in the closet and recuperate and give herself some self-love. So that is what I did. But I will say I did miss being here with all of you from all parts of the world. You have all reached out to me and shown me your support in more ways than I can ever even express to you. And that means the world to me to know that I've got a wonderful group of people who care about my well-being and who want to support me. So thank you very, very much. You can go to ufoclassified.com if you would like to become a Patreon. And I want to just thank Charles, who just pledged his support to the show. That is really wonderful. And you can also get in here on YouTube and click and like the show and share. Please do. Have not had enough time to commit to doing the social media things that I need to. I'm sure you can understand why. But hopefully I will get my mojo on soon. I'm finding my power. So anyway, thank you. And I want to just thank you guys again in Amy Collins, Shadowy Spectrums. I mean, all of you guys, Grandmaster UV, all of you, Steve, for getting in here. This is a real family night. I feel like this is my family home evening here. With my friends. And it's always great to have Scott Brown here, who does the wonderful graphics for the show, the intro, outro, everything, all the things we see each week with the guests. They're really wonderful, Scott. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank Mario, who does a lot of work behind the scenes and has been a bigger support than I can't even put into words over the years. And I've said this on many shows, but he has been there religiously and helped me and supported me and been a friend and gotten this show to YouTube back when I was doing the podcast. And so it's all of these wonderful people that I've met. And I met Mario through Scott's wonderful Facebook page, In the Field. And I have to say that's a great group of people, and they're very respectable. Scott and Mario, you guys have done, or Will, all of you guys have done such a great job over the years. I love it. So anyway, just know that I'm grateful to all of you. And after the couple years I've had, it feels good to be grateful.
I just want to say I'm glad you're safe. And, I'm not going to mention too much about this. People have read about it online. But I just want to say that people should point out and put a spotlight on these type of situations. And this has happened in my family with people who are no longer with this family. And, I give you a ton of credit for the courage that you've had to do what you've done.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. It's been a hard thing for me to try to figure out what to do, and I knew pretty early on that when I was turning to specific places and organizations in Utah, that I wasn't going to get any help unless I kind of became my own advocate. And had it not been for the incredible work of Nate Carlisle on Fox 13 News to put out the story, which is really important. And like you mentioned, this affects so many people, and I'm not alone. I've had wonderful people reach out to me. And so that has been a blessing. And I always think there definitely is after you get through hard times in your life, or you're going through hard times in your life, there definitely, you can learn from them and help other people at the end of the day. And that's a powerful thing. So that's a great way to heal and do other things. So anyway, thank you guys. And hey, Alien Girl, thank you. So I want to introduce my guest this evening, our guest this evening, because I have to say, and I'm trying to unmute his mic, but it's not working for some odd reason.
Oh, that was me.
See, you're so naughty. I mean, usually, you can't do that to me. Thank you, Mike. Mike, thank you for the nice donation. Thank you. I want to, and much love, Erica. Great to see you and Scott, and you've got this, and thank you. Thank you very much. So Stephen Snyder has been on my show many times. I've been on his show as well, and we first got to know each other. What has it been over? It's been over a year, right?
Yeah. I think it was probably right around a year. I think when I first reached out to you, and because it was November 2020, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow, good memory. And it was really cool because I hadn't known, I mean, I'd read a little bit that you'd put forward, but I really didn't understand until we started talking how interconnected all of these things are. And you've done some really, really deep dives into things. And I think that's important. I always say in the UFO world, we assume we take people at face value. We take organizations at face value. And oftentimes there is something, unfortunately, lurking under the skin of all of this that is a little more suspect. And I appreciate that you've done your work with regard to all of this. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about some of these things tonight. I know Scott has some questions as well. And so tell us give us your background for people who have not heard you on the show before.
Well, I got into all this, I guess it was about 11 years ago when I launched my blog, Visip, which you can find at visipview.blogspot.com. That's all one word, VISUPVIEW.blogspot.com. And I launched it on October 10th, 2010. So, just going into a little past the 11-year anniversary now, I suppose, ironically. I definitely would say I've grown up a lot since I first started it. I've always kind of explored a little bit of everything, though I came out of the, kind of synchro mystical movement. I always kind of consider Chris Knowles of the Secret Sun to be my mentor. Definitely, that was really very much where Visip kind of got its inspiration in the early days. But I think definitely in around 2012, 2013, I kind of started to find my own style and started to do more parapolitical research, especially in context to, I guess, what the kids kind of refer to now as the secret right, sort of this sort of shadow network with the Council of National Policy and the CIRCAL and all that kind of stuff. But I've always tried to keep things, in that sort of category of high weird. I'm really fascinated by sort of the intersection between a lot of these, kind of far right groups and, a lot of the sort of woo-woo stuff, because it's a connection that you really wouldn't expect to see a lot of, but it's actually shockingly prevalent. So that's something I've tried to highlight over the years. Finally got around to doing my first book towards the beginning of 2020, Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, which I co-wrote with Frank Zero, who was another kind of accolade of Knowles and kind of grew up around the Secret Sun milieu. And then I did my second book, which was on Epstein. Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment, both of which are available on Amazon. And I also launched the podcast, The Farm, around the end of 2019, initially to promote the book, but I kind of took on a life of its own, and it's definitely been growing over the last year or so. So, it's been an interesting 2 years for me, especially kind of finding myself and doing a lot of different stuff. So.
Well, and I mean, and that's the crazy thing. You and I have had shows where I was on your show a few months back with Jack Brewer,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a really interesting show because of the connections, specifically with some of the work that he's done about NICAP and things, and the people that were involved early on and well throughout the whole, actually all of the history of the organization. But that was very fascinating, and so I would definitely suggest them to go back and listen to your show that we did, all of your shows. Actually, you've done so many things that are really groundbreaking, and I'm sure ruffle a lot of feathers.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And in fact, I'm so glad you were in town here a few months ago. When was that? Like July? That
It was
was
June.
End of June. And so that was really that was something. It was nice to meet you, and then nice to have a conversation with you after. And I wish that I could have had more energy, but that was right when things were really hitting a sort of climax in my personal life. And so, but I mean, it's just, I'm fascinated. And so let's talk about the secret sun for people who don't understand. They might be hearing that and wondering what specifically that is.
Well, it was a blog that Chris Knowles launched, I want to say around 2007, if I'm not mistaken. Chris had worked for Marvel Comics for a lot of years, designing some of the merchandise and a lot of other stuff. I'm not real sure about all the things that he did for Marvel, so don't quote me on that. Sorry, Chris. Don't have your bio here at hand. But anyway, he started doing this book, Our Gods Wear Spandex, I think around '07, and originally had launched The Sun to kind of explore some of those topics. And then from there, he did The Secret History of Rock and Roll. And obviously, Secret Sun has always been a bit of a pop culture centric blog, but Chris tackles a lot of the other stuff as well. And gradually, it kind of got into like more political type stuff, I would say, during the past decade. To be perfectly honest, Chris is actually probably my favorite political commentator, even though I know he definitely would not consider himself to be one. But, you know, again, I always find that sort of interpretation to be really interesting. I'm a big fan of Gordon White, of Rune Soup as well, who, you know, is also kind of connected with Chris. They do a lot of stuff together. So, you know, I kind of find people who have that more maybe mystical take on stuff to be much more interesting when trying to understand current events. I suppose there is a certain spiritual component to all of this stuff that, I mean, tends to be overlooked. And I think, you know, people like Chris and Gordon do a great job of providing a prism through which you can kind of view a lot of these events through.
And so let's talk a little bit about, because you and I, and not to jump around, but I will because I'm good that way. But let's talk a little bit about the hacker community and talk about some of the influences that are lurking around in the UFO community.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting subject. I mean, I had never really looked at the hacker stuff too much until I started working on the book that I'm currently working on. My sort of interest in it initially was its links to Discordianism, because kind of surprisingly, there was a very, you know, early tie to that, specifically with the one big hacker confab in Germany. What is it? The Chaos Computer Club, I believe, is what it's called. They had like an early member there who was involved in some espionage. They tried to sell some data, I think, that they had hacked from maybe it was the National Security Agency. I can't remember correctly now. But the guy was a big fan of you know, the Illuminatus trilogy, and he, in fact, I'd even used Hagbert Klein, I think, as his hacker alias, and had eventually committed suicide under rather mysterious circumstances in 1988. But the Chaos Computer Club had always had sort of that Discordian element, and as I started to look more into it as well, I started to realize that a lot of you know, early hacker culture had been heavily influenced by Discordianism. It really came out of like a lot of the zines and that type of thing from the 1980s. And it was only really later that, you know, kind of pertaining to some of the UFO stuff, that I started to realize that there was another, you know, kind of interesting connection with that as well. I mean, especially in terms of some of the aviary people, I suppose it's been, you know, maybe hiding a bit in the open all along. But, you know, Rich Doty, for instance, I had claimed on a few occasions that he was a bit of a hacker. But when you start looking at some of these other people, I mean, I know Hal Puthoff, you know, long before he had gotten involved in the remote viewing stuff, had worked in the NSA on, you know, cryptography and that kind of thing, which probably involved, you know, kind of proto version of hacking, trying to, you know, crack Soviet ciphers and that type of thing. You know, you have the whole sort of connection with the ARPANET. I mean, of course, Jacques Vallée. There's a debate as to whether or not he was technically a member of the Aviary or not. I mean, I think probably fellow traveler would at least be a fair assessment. He was a major figure in setting up, you know, the whole internet revolution, really. I mean, his work on the ARPANET later in the 1980s, working as a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. Of course, he's a computer scientist. And I mean, I've certainly heard that a few of the other members, too, aren't too shabby with computers as well. So, yeah, there is that kind of interesting component to that. And, you know, I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, they were able to do some really, you know, interesting stuff with Serpo when that kind of broke out online in the early noughts, or mid noughts, I guess you would say. But and then of course there's, you know, sort of the connection with Richard Team, I think it is, and you know, I mean, he's always tied in with you know, again, DEF CON in Las Vegas. He's also written a lot on the UFO thing. But it's interesting because he had that kind of long time association with the hacker group, the Cult of the Dead Cow, and this is the one that really has a lot of ties, you know, to the the national security establishment. I mean, the one hacker Mudge ended up going on to essentially head the ARPANET, or the DARPA's, whole thing on internet security during the last decade. And, there's been a lot of other ties about that. But the Cult of the Dead Cow is really interesting, certainly. And just the whole sort of culture that sprung up around DEF CON. I mean, of course, the founder of DEF CON now is, I think like a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Atlantic Council simultaneously. So Jeff Moss, I think is his name. But, when you look at this kind of stuff more and more, it definitely seems like DEF CON was really set up to sort of, provide the national security services as a grounds to sort of recruit some of this quote unquote talent from the hacker community. And, we saw some sort of early signs of this maybe in the late 90s with the sort of low key war that broke out between the US and Chinese hackers. There was even that whole, the Hong Kong Blondes, which was another thing that traces to the Cult of the Dead Cow. It was essentially this fictitious Chinese group that some of the members had dreamed up, and they tried to make it seem like it was this big insurgency in China that was being from no, it was based out of Canada, and they were trying to like launch this attack on the Chinese firewall and all this other kind of insanity, and had no basis in reality. But it actually did inspire some real hacking attacks on China. From this, what was basically a LARP that the Cult of the Dead Cow had been engaged in. So, I mean, there was a lot of that kind of weird prankster stuff. And certainly, I mean, that's interesting in light of, some of the things that later came out about Serpo and a lot of the stuff in the UFO community, quite frankly. But yeah, I mean, there is this sort of strange, unacknowledged connection between hacking and, this kind of stuff. And I think to some extent it may well, like a lot of these things, go back to what was going on at SRI in the 70s, with all the stuff at the ARPANET and the remote viewing program and a lot of this other insanity. But we do know, from some of the work that David Metcalf and Dana Walsh-Pasulka did, in that one essay, there were experimentations that were being done with the ARPANET stuff, with some of the stuff that was going on at SRI. So, I mean, there was a cross-pollination there. And it would be interesting to know, I mean, just how much of this, was related to psychological warfare efforts and all this other kind of stuff that was going on at the time.
Well, let's go back to specifically SRI, Stanford Research Institute, because that's where Puthoff and co, back in the 70s. I mean, that was really... that's where all of this gets interesting, in my opinion, late 60s, early 70s and things. So explain a little bit about what they could potentially have been doing.
Well, I mean, I think a big part of it was certainly related to psychological warfare. And I think this is a component that, isn't really discussed a lot. But I mean, you have to go back to the early sort of forays into, ESP and that kind of thing that the national security establishment looked into going into the 1950s. And the big guy with a lot of this was Adrena Puharich. Puharich had claimed that he was brought into a program, kind of behavior modification realm with the Navy that he said was called Penguin in 1947. Nobody's found any existence of a program, but the Navy did launch a program called Pelican in 47, which seems like it was likely, what he was actually talking about. Now, this was later brought into Project Artichoke, which Morris Allen oversaw. And this, Morris Allen was Puharich's big patron by the early 50s within the national security establishment for his work in this kind of research. Now, Puharich gave a presentation to the military brass in 1953 that's been cited as, kind of a cornerstone for when the U.S. National Security Establishment got involved in this. But the thing a lot of people forget about this is it was addressed specifically to the Army's Psychological Warfare Board, and it was discussing the applications of ESP to psychological warfare. And that's something that nobody ever really looks at. And kind of get to why they would be interested in that, you have to understand Russia and their own approach to ESP. Now, there's been a lot of crap written about this, especially about stuff that went on in the Stalin era. And it really doesn't seem like, especially, once World War II got going, there was any really research going on while Stalin was alive. But in the early years of the Soviet Union, it was a big thing. In the 1920s, the KGB, or an early incarnation of it, had actually set up their own program. It was, run by a guy, Gleb Boyki, I think. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. I mean, it's a Russian name, but anyway, they did do some actual research for the Chekhov, I believe is what they would have been called at the time, and there were other programs too that were being done at around Leningrad, or no, Petrograd, I believe, at the university there, and a lot of this was an offshoot of cosmism, and the Russian cosmosist movement, which was kind of like a proto version of transhumanism. They were obsessed with life extension, with space exploration, and a lot of this other stuff. It kind of got going in the late 19th century, and it really got into the Russian scientific community in the early 20th. And, this sort of from there came the whole notion that ESP was a real phenomenon and it could be explained by electromagnetic radiation and that type of thing. And this was a concept that a lot of the people in the Soviet Union were looking at in the 1920s and the 1930s. To what extent, we don't really know, but it was definitely in the air. Now, another thing that the cosmetists sort of helped to develop was the whole notion of the noonosphere. Now, they weren't the originators of that. That came from a Jesuit priest, what was his name? Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, I believe. But it was sort of developed concurrently in the East and the West, kind of during the 20s and the 1930s and the years leading up to the Second World War. And then it really became big in the aftermath of it. But I'll get to that in a second. So anyway, there was a certain amount of toleration in the Soviet Union in the 20s and up through the early 30s for this kind of research. Stalin, though, consolidated his hold on power, and he really put the kibosh on it. That was probably partly due to the fact that a lot of the support for ESP research kind of came from circles associated with Trotsky, who was really, out of favor by that point in time, to put it mildly. So anyway, there's not really a lot done with this until Stalin dies, like in the early 50s. And then even then, it's very tentative. So I think it was in late 1959, there's that famous story that was planted by Jacques Berger, who was Jacques Vallée's contemporary later on, about how the U.S. Navy was doing those experiments with ESP on the submarines. And once the Soviets saw that, it gave the scientific community a certain amount of certainty that they could go forward and start proposing this research again. So they really pushed forward this stuff, and this is where a lot of the psychotronic weapons stuff really got going as well. The Moscow signal kicked off in 1962, I think. And it's possible there might have been some covert stuff. There's been a lot of rumors for years that some of this research was also done by the Nazis under the auspices of the NNRB, and that the Soviets had gotten some of the documentation for that. But there's just not a lot of evidence of any of this research being done from 1937 till about like the late 50s. But once the Soviets got going, they really seem to have gotten passionate about it. It's not really talked about, but I mean, the Soviets almost had their own Aquarian age in the 1960s. I mean, they had this kind of, revival, this ESP research. They also got really into the UFO thing during this era. They actually kind of toyed with the notion of ancient astronauts going all the way back to the late 1950s. And this was sort of continuing through the 1960s. So, yeah, they were kind of openly talking about like a lot of this woo-woo kind of stuff. Now, the U.S. intelligence community had already been looking at Soviet superstitions in ways that they could manipulate it with psychological warfare. The RAND Corporation had done a big study on this, I think, around 1949 or thereabouts. And I suspect that this is what Puharich was doing when he talked to the military about, ESP for psychological warfare purposes. So they plant this story with Jacques Berger in the late 1950s, and then suddenly this stuff massively kicks off in the Soviet Union. And, I'm guessing that they thought, wow, we really had some success with this. Now, around the same time, Jacques Vallée gets signed to Regnery Press and starts publishing his really academic studies on UFOs in the mid-1960s. Now, Regnery was headed by Henry Regnery at the time, who was a part of this body called the Institute for American Strategy, which was basically designed to promote political warfare domestically, which is another term for psychological warfare. It also established a lot of the funding network for what became the New Right during the 1970s. The Coors family was connected to it. Richard Mellon Scaife was connected to it. Some of the funding conduits were sort of tied in with the Koch brothers and what have you. So, I mean, this was a big, psychological warfare thing. I mean, it pushed mainly a lot of your John Bircher type society stuff. But that's why it's kind of interesting that Regnery and how, the process of all this just kind of signs Vallée. And then Vallée issues these two, his first two UFO books were these really scholarly academic studies of it. And of course, he himself was a very reputable scientist. And the Soviets ate this up. Okay. I mean, he goes into his journals about how he was contacted by some of the top Soviet researchers in UFOs around the mid 1960s. And he's in contact with them. So, this is all, again, really, really interesting, especially since they're right now knee deep in that whole, ancient astronaut thing that they're promoting. So then, you fast forward a couple years later and the SRI thing gets going. So again, with SRI, they're kind of looking at this from the same perspective of the Soviets. Metcalf and Pasulka make a pretty compelling argument that Deschardes and the whole notion of the noonosphere was really big around SRI at the time as well. And I mean, this is the same, kind of ideology that's driving the Soviet system. And it eventually creeps into the broader New Age movement. I mean, this is the thing that, like Barbara Marx Hubbard, for instance, massively was promoting to a lot of her followers. And point out, Barbara Marx Hubbard later went on to become a member of Task Force Delta, which was that kind of New Agey think tank that John Alexander was involved with in the Army in the 1980s. The 1st Earth Battalion came out of this with Jim Channon and all those other people. So Barbara Marx Hubbard was a part of the mix too, and then she ends up promoting all this noonosphere stuff and all this other thing. So meanwhile, you've got Puthoff there and all these guys at SRI. This, along with the fundamental physics group, which was, going on at Berkeley, and there was a lot of intersection. This is people like Jack Sarfati and all those types, all the quantum physicists. This is what really provided, the scientific quote unquote explanation for the New Age movement, okay, and supposedly provided, a rationalistic explanation to a lot of these Eastern teachings, which, again, would probably have an undeniable appeal to the Russians, especially given this particular time, which again is, really interesting, especially when you consider how many spooks are, involved in promoting all this kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is like a major component to all this that we have to consider. And it's not to say that, there isn't legitimate phenomenon that was happening at SRI, that they didn't produce real stuff. But I do think that ultimately, it was blue sky research. We really didn't care whether or not it produced legitimate results. In fact, it seems like, while they thought that ESP was a real thing very early in SRI, they didn't think it had a practical intelligence or military application because it was too unpredictable. But you keep pushing this stuff for the Russians because it's, probably forcing them to waste money on, stuff that isn't going to be as effective as winning the Cold War as, intercontinental ballistic missile systems or something to that effect. But then on the other hand, you're targeting the belief systems that are very prevalent, in my opinion, within elements of the intellectia, within, the scientific community and so forth. You've still got these cosmetists in the Russian scientific community. They're big in the noonosphere. And, this is a big thing in Russia that would only get bigger in the post-Soviet years. But I mean, I think this is an underlining factor to, why you have like the hot tub diplomacy and all this other stuff happening by the late 1980s at Esalen.
Right. Let's talk about Esalen, the Esalen Institute.
Because again, Murphy, he was making ventures to the Soviet Union, I think, going back to at least the early 1970s. And again, it was the parapsychological research that was used as a justification for that. So, I mean, they have this sort of ongoing relationship with the Russians going all the way back to at least the early 70s. And Esalen uses this as a way to get people behind the Iron Curtain, to go meet up with people in the Russian fields researching this kind of stuff. So, again, there's no way that they could have been doing this kind of stuff without the U.S. intelligence community, keeping abreast of it. And this is at a time when, you've got guys like Targ and Puthoff going there to, do their seminars at Esalen on ESP and what have you. I mean, I'm sure, you've got guys like Puharich and what have you lurking in the background. So, yeah, I mean, it's, a very rich milieu that's going on there with Esalen and, kind of this, budding New Age ideology as well.
Right. And I will say that's nestled in a beautiful spot in Northern California. It's in Big Sur, from what I'm remembering. But I mean, yeah, definitely you can go back and look for the Esalen Institute and look at some of the articles that have been written about the potential spy games going on in the hot tubs and different things. And that is fascinating. And I also think it's fascinating that, even in, a couple years ago, we had a group of UFO researchers from all over the world that went over to Russia to speak at a conference that was Russian and Chinese. They had sponsored that event. And it's, it's always interesting to me to see how some of these things play out. And I don't know, it's shocking to me that people don't make a bigger connection. I think we're pretty short-sighted sometimes in the UFO community with regard to this.
Oh yeah, and I mean it's something again that I think it's been obvious. It's just like you're saying. I think a lot of people just really didn't know how to look, just didn't know to look for it. I mean, on the one hand, especially with the civilian UFO groups, I mean they would have been an obvious target for the Russians because of again, a fair amount of the sightings that are probably being reported by some of these groups are classified U.S., aircrafts and that type of thing. So for the Russians, I mean, this is an easy way to gather intelligence on highly classified U.S. military technology. And, I mean, you have this sort of kooky explanation that's not going to ruffle any feathers if it gets out. I mean, for that reason alone, the spies on our end are going to be looking heavily at the UFO community as well. And I mean, that was, exactly the type of thing that William Moore had strongly indicated when he started discussing his work with the Aviary and some of the things that they were looking at. But yeah, I mean,
and can you tell us who that is?
William Moore was, I mean, depending upon who you ask, I mean, some people tend to say that the Aviary was largely his creation. I mean, I don't think that was all the case, though he was certainly the one who came up with the bird names. That was, I guess, a way for him and his research
Jimmy
partner.
Chandray,
Yeah, to talk to them or talk about them on the phone and that type of thing. But Moore was the author of two works. The first one was the Philadelphia Experiment, and the second one was Roswell, which he had co-written with Charles Sperlitz, was it?
Mm-hmm.
And those were both big works. I mean, the Philadelphia Experiment really had reintroduced interest in that whole affair. I think it was Morris Jessup had written the book about it initially in the 1950s, and it really had not been talked about very much since then. Moore had come to the conclusion that it was mostly a bogus story that had potentially been put out by the Navy to cover up the experiments they were doing with the radar cloaking technology. Who really knows, but a lot of people ultimately believed it, and it's become more outlandish as the years have gone on. I mean, of course, in the 1980s, you had the movies come out that, were suggesting that time travel had been managed, the Philadelphia Experiment and all this other kind of stuff. And then, of course, there was the Roswell incident, which was the book that really put Moore on the map. And that was also the book that had renewed interest in Roswell. I mean, again, it was a very, little known incident prior to the
Right.
Roswell incident coming out in 1980. And, of course, given Moore's later role in spreading disinformation, and I mean, a lot of these mythos that were linked to the Aviary in the 1980s, I mean, you do have to wonder, what was going on with that as well. I mean, obviously, James Carrion, I think, has done some great work on, Roswell as a disinformation operation in the first place. I mean, the whole story around that is really interesting. I think, what was it, like Stanton, Friedman, and Moore were in Louisiana or something like that, and somebody just kind of randomly suggested that they should go talk to Jesse Marcel Sr., who then started kind of spilling the whole story about what had really happened at Roswell. And I mean, certainly given some of the later things that happened to Moore, I mean, you do have to wonder if he was maybe even being approached as far back as that. Stanton Friedman, of course, had been in contact with Jacques Vallée, at least going back to, I think, 75, maybe even a little earlier. So, again, he was kind of, loosely connected to this whole network too.
And so let me just ask you, because I got a question from Ryan Gordon, who's in chat, and he wants to know, he's like, what is the Aviary? Because I know people that don't have the knowledge that we do don't really understand what and who the Aviary is and how that first came into being. You had mentioned Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray, and how they'd created these code names for people that they were running with, or that had been contacting them. I mean, people like Hal Putoff, Ron Pandolfi, John Alexander, Jacques Vallée, different people like that. And so, can you explain a little bit more about the aviary?
Sure. Well, again, there's a lot of dispute about, like, first off, I mean, how far back it really went. The aviary figures have generally insisted on a later date for its, kind of inception. Of course, it was an informal group. It's not like there was a founding charter or anything like that. So Moore started to officially interact with this network around 1980. This is when he came in contact with Richard Doty and the legendary Falcon. Nobody really knows for sure who Falcon was. A lot of people think that Doty was actually Falcon, but Moore has long insisted that he was not. But regardless, these were the two intelligence officers that he was principally dealing with in the area around the Kirtland Air Force Base during 1980 onwards, when the whole thing with the Benowitz affair was playing out and so forth. And, that was for a while cited as kind of the genesis of the aviary. But then when Exempt for Disclosure came out around 2005, it was put out that the formal start date, I guess, quote unquote, happened at a meeting that occurred in the fall of 1986 in Beaver Creek, Ohio, at the house of a man named Ernie Keller Strauss. Colonel Ernie Keller Strauss, who had worked at Wright-Patterson's Foreign Technology Division for a lot of years. And other people present at this meeting included John Alexander, I believe Robert Collins, maybe C.B. Jones, but a couple of the guys who later became sort of the backbone of the aviary. Keller Strauss told a lot of stories that were very similar to some of the stuff that Doty was later, or who had said to Moore earlier in like 1980, I think. Keller Strauss, it's really interesting. He had also told a lot of the same things to Bruce Maccabee around 1985, who also later went into the aviary. But Keller Strauss was the guy who had really pushed the whole narrative with the Red and the Yellow book. The Red book was the government history, I think, of UFOs here since 47, and then the Yellow book wasn't actually a book. It was a crystal that the aliens had that told their own history, and when they picked it up, it would start and it would project holograms telling how Jesus was a space brother and that type of thing. Rick Doty tried to use it one time, but his puny human biology wouldn't trigger it for some reason. Anyway, so yeah, this is the kind of stuff that Keller Strauss was giving them as invaluable revelations as to the actual MJ-12 and all this kind of stuff. So Keller Strauss claimed that his source for at least some of this was Dale Graff, who later went on, who was a civilian employee for the Air Force at Wright-Patterson. Of course, he had started to sponsor some of the SRI remote viewing stuff around the late 1970s, around the time that the CIA was getting out. And he was later brought into the DIA and had effectively overseen what became Stargate, which was both the SRI program and the stuff that was being done at Fort Meade. So Graff also was later brought into the aviary as well, though as far as I can gather, Keller Strauss described Graff as palling around with the MJ-12 group during his time at Wright-Pat in the late 1970s, but as far as I can tell, nobody ever really sat Dale Graff down and asked him, "Hey, Dale, did anything Keller Strauss say about you? Is it actually true?" Which I find to be kind of funny, since they've been saying a lot, attributing a lot of this stuff to Graff for years. But yeah, so Graff has never really weighed in one way or the other if anything that Keller Strauss said had a basis in reality, as far as I know. It's one of the things about the aviary. They love to call each other dirty names and so forth in public a lot. So that kind of further muddies the water as to what exactly is going on, because they do attack each other from time to time. And yeah, it does get kind of interesting in that end. But so anyway, there's the sort of narratives that either the Aviary sort of started with this group of intelligence officers that William Moore was collecting as sources in 1980, or concurrently there was this also Ohio network that was set up by Keller Strauss around the mid 1980s, and that is at least the official musings of how the Aviary got going. I think that the origins were much earlier. You could potentially go back to what Jacques Vallée had described as the Invisible College. I mean, this was a group of researchers, Jan Hynek and what have you, that it kind of started to come together in the 1960s. This later had a lot of overlap with what was going on at SRI, but I definitely think SRI was really the actual genesis of the Aviary. A lot of the guys would later end up becoming big figures in the Aviary, like Puthoff, like Vallée, like Kit Green, and Dale Graff, as we were just talking about. I mean, these guys had all started out working with the SRI stuff or for it directly during the 1970s. And again, that kind of brings the question as to how much of this mythos that the Aviary was spreading, and again, as I've tried to kind of allude to, it was considerable. Roswell was something that Bill Moore had really put on the map. Benowitz, is where we get a lot of the Dulce mythos from, the deep underground bases, all this other kind of stuff that's tied in with Los Alamos and what have you. A lot of that was being, fed to Benowitz and to William Moore by Richard Doty during the 1980s, the early 1980s, and it later got into the UFO community. This is where MJ12 came from. The first reference to MJ12 that we're aware of was something that William Moore saw in 1980 when he was shown the Aquarius documents, I think. He was later allowed to make a copy of those in 1981 or something like that. They kind of spread around a group of researchers, which is where MJ12 first kind of started to make inroads into the UFO community. And then, of course, there were the 35 millimeter slides that were sent to Sheridan in 1984 or something like that. And then the eventual leak in 86 by Timothy Good. I mean, it seems like the Aviary was probably involved in that as well. So MJ12 was another offshoot of all of this stuff. And then, of course, at the same time, they were doing the, Alexander's advanced theoretical physics group, which is what Howard Bloom wrote about and Out There, which came out in 1991. This was his, quote unquote UFO working group. The main figure that he describes in there is running the UFO working group. A Colonel Harold E. Phillips, I believe, was modeled upon Alexander and Ron Blackburn. And a lot of the people involved with, the Advanced Theoretical Physics Project were, also members of the Aviary. Puthoff was involved with it. I believe Kit Green was involved with it. Jacques Vallée was involved with it. So it seems like there was certainly this group of intelligence officers, I think, going back to at least the SRI days, who served as the basis for this. And gradually it sort of brought in all of these other figures. It's possible. I mean, Alexander and some of these other guys might have been involved even sooner. An interesting thing about that is Alexander and Doty both seem like they were involved in covert operations in Thailand in 1968. The guy who was overseeing U.S. military operations at the time there was a General Richard Stilwell. Stilwell did a lot of covert operations, to put it mildly. He was one of the visionaries behind the Joint Special Operations Command. He had a vast private intelligence network when he was serving as the Undersecretary of Defense for Reagan, I think, during the early 80s. But Stilwell had an interest in a lot of the stuff related to ESP and UFOs as well. Alexander kind of describes him as being affiliated with that Task Force Delta that I was just talking about a little bit earlier. And Stilwell was the guy who had put Alexander under the command of Stubblebind at INSCOM during the 1980s, and kind of greased the skids for him to do a lot of this woo-woo research. So Stilwell was Alexander's boss back in 68 when he was Green Beret with the A-teams in Thailand. And there's a good chance if Doty was stationed in Thailand in 68, Stilwell would have been his boss there as well. So, there's still some debate about that, if Doty actually was the Richard Doty who was working as a combat controller in Thailand and Laos in 68. But he was, he might have had that connection to Stilwell going back to that time as well. Stilwell was another guy kind of tied into that far right, American Security Council network. So, again, I, just gotten into Valet's ties with that, with Regnery and some of these other people. So again, that raises some interesting questions as to whether or not it was kind of a long-term psychological operation or what. But it does seem like, there was this sort of early genesis with the 50s with stuff that Puharich and some of these other characters were doing, especially a lot of these Navy guys. And then later, the Aviary people sort of took up the baton, I guess, around the 1970s. It's a debate, though, in my mind, as to whether or not, this was a deliberate passing of the torch, or if the Aviary sort of kind of became aware of this older, kind of working group, if you will, and have been spending the last 50 years trying to discern what it was actually trying to do. And in the process kind of became lost in the Hall of Mirrors that was left in its aftermath.
Well, okay. I mean, you've got so much information. It just is absolutely mind-blowing. I think everybody in chat is saying the same thing. It's like okay, can I just sit in a room with you for 2 years and listen to you? Even a day, I learned so much every time I talk to you. So what Marina wants me to ask you, what do you attribute to what's happening today politically with the right's ability to brainwash people?
Well, I mean, that's...
And I'm sure that goes in both, it's all over the map, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I suppose it's a complicated thing to answer, but again, I mean, I think a lot of it's at least partly. Let's see. Well, how can I put this? I mean, I suppose there's a practical explanation for that, and then there's sort of the metaphysical explanation to it. The practical one, again, sort of goes back to a lot of the research that the ARPA was doing back in the 60s and the 70s related to computers. Again, a component to the ARPANET research that's not really talked about a lot was how they tried to apply some of this, how they tried to apply behavioral science research to some of the things that they were doing with the internet. And specifically, this was related to Vietnam and the efforts there, and essentially the counterinsurgency operations. So they theorized that you could use, this sort of early version of the ARPANET that they were putting together to compile data on people. And this would help you do, personality profiles and what have you in civilian populations, which would make it easier to pacify them. So this was sort of something that was always baked into the internet. And, many years later, this is effectively what Cambridge Analytica ultimately did, with the stuff that they were compiling from Facebook. Though, again, it should probably be pointed out that I think the real architect of a lot of this was Peter Thiel, going back to the stuff that he was trying to do with, the foundation of Palantir around 2002 and thereabouts.
Right.
Because, again, Thiel was the guy who really set up Facebook with the investments and so forth that helped launch it. And, Palantir seems like it's had interest in using massive data to, essentially compile personality profiles from a very early start date. So it's interesting that Thiel then puts up the money for Facebook, which became one of the biggest, data gathering institutions ever founded. And then, of course, going back, I think to around 2001 or something, there was the whole scandal with H.R. Gary. That came out where, again, they had been looking at Facebook to try to use that to compile data on people. And it was revealed that Palantir was one of their partners. It blew up. H.R. Gary was who took most of the blame for it. And then a few years later, Cambridge Analytica starts doing this kind of research. Palantir, had some kind of relationship. Maybe they helped, send a data scientist or two to them, help them, come up with the personality profiles. They try to cover that up, though. But, this was the kind of technology that, had, that we've been working on for many years. And certainly with what, has been managed with social media, I think finally, you had all of this data that you could finally use to do these highly accurate personality profiles. And this drifts into stuff that, was later done, I think by elements of the far right, with people like Steve Bannon and so forth, who were sponsoring the research that were being done with Cambridge. And then, of course, obviously Peter Thiel himself. So, I mean, that's kind of one explanation.
Well, and Peter Thiel, from my understanding, from my recollection, has been in the background sponsoring a couple of UFO conferences.
Yeah, he seems like he's been getting into this.
So
Yeah.
yeah, which is interesting, and it from my, and I don't quote me on this. I will fact check this and let you know. But from my recollection, I believe that Lou Elizondo might have been involved in one of those conferences. And so I'm going to figure that out and I will verify that. So I'm just putting that out there. But it is very interesting,
Yeah.
when you look at some of the people, and then you look at, you go back to Utah and you look at the fact that here we are, this hub of data, collection. I mean, we've got the NSA, we've got all sorts of things going on, and,
Well,
and
yeah, it was
Silicon Slopes, and
oh gosh, there was actually one of the companies in Utah. I think it started with a Q, Quantex, I think, or something.
Qualtech.
Yeah, that it helped provide some of the data to Cambridge Analytica. So there actually is already that connection there with Utah. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a thing. And Teal also, I mean, obviously he, initially made his fortune off of PayPal, and that kind of brings up the whole thing with the PayPal mafia. I mean, that also includes Elon Musk, for instance. So there's a lot of interesting people kind of tied in with that whole, milieu in and of itself. It's something John Brisson and I have, of course, looked at a lot lately. But getting into sort of the more, woo-woo explanations to some of this, I mean, it really can be traced back to, some of Bruno's concepts of magical workings from the Renaissance, really. Again, I mean, in his descriptions of a magical act, I mean, it's remarkably similar to what Cambridge was trying to do. I mean, one of the first things that Bruno advocated for the magician to do was to do a personality profile. He didn't use those exact words, but I mean, that's essentially what he's suggesting, because, you got to understand your target audience. That's a crucial factor to getting these kinds of things to work. And then the next thing that was really crucial was a way to sort of breach the subconscious mind to apply what he would refer to as the chain. And that's, I think, something that you do, especially effectively in social media with memes and that kind of stuff. It's a way to sort of implant ideals in people, often in a humorous fashion that really bypasses their conscious analytical mind and targets them at a subconscious level. And, this was exactly the kind of thing that Bruno was advocating going back to the 17th century. So, this is the kind of techniques that have been known in certain esoteric circles for a very long time. And, I don't think that this kind of stuff is lost on contemporaries. Steve Bannon is the kind of guy who I think would definitely have an interest in this kind of stuff. And certainly, a lot of my information on Bruno comes from an excellent work done by a researcher called Culiano, called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. And Culiano was actually murdered in the early 90s, and most likely by members of the Romanian Iron Guard, which was a far-right organization, due to some of the things that he had written about their particular history. So, there were people in these circles who were tracking what people like Giuliano were writing about. And, when you look at some of the things that he was advocating with how magic had modern applications with psychological warfare, and what has since happened in the 21st century on social media with the whole notion of mimetic warfare and so forth, it's very interesting.
It is. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think, for me, people don't, the more I delve into this, the more I learn from you and the more I read about all of this, the more I can't understand why people just assume that Facebook or getting into specific groups or going on social media, why you wouldn't. I mean, it's a great way to pull out every bit of information about you and the UFO groups. And then you look at the fact that Bigelow's buying UFO databases and Jacques Vallée is, creating the databases. And what are they doing with this? What are they doing with people who have had alleged UFO abduction encounters? So they're psychologically profiling these people to what end? Is that to learn how to manipulate people? Is there, a faction of people who are taking this conspiracy culture and manipulating that for their political gain? Because you've got people who you can see distrust the government over here, who are looking for alternative healthcare over here, and now you can insert the anti-vax narrative, you can insert A, B, C, and D, and then you've got the people who are in the UFO community. You know, we already don't trust the government, so I'm going to go out there and say, you know, the government is, you know, bad, and we should be holding these people accountable and lighting the torches and things. And I think that there is a real I think that we need to be very careful about that and step back and look at the big picture, which again, none of us seem to do, you know, in the UFO communities. We're looking at specific cases, or we're, you know, trying to talk about, you know, a certain person or thing and look at it from a very narrow perspective. But there's a big picture here. And the big picture, in my opinion, is about a political gain. And there might not be a lot to do with UFOs at the end of the day for me.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, you know, I mean, I think especially with developments in the UFO community, I mean, in the last probably, 10 to 20 years or so, I mean, I think another element about this too, that, especially with sort of the gradual rightward drift that we have to sort of look at, is also the component of having so many big financiers enter the picture who are Mormons. This is something that they kind of brought up in the recent book that came out, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, rather briefly, but I mean, it was touched upon. Henry Reed had addressed the fact that his Mormon faith had influenced his decision to sort of greenlight this program, ultimately to try to get the funding for what Bigelow was doing. And then later it was acknowledged that a certain amount of the people at the Skinwalker Ranch, a rather good amount of them, were Mormons. And certainly also you have the rather connections to Brendan Fugel taking over the ranch, and some of the other donors like Joe Firmage, potentially Dan Marriott, I think. The thing with that, and I mean, in a lot of ways, it does seem, rather obvious and to some extent maybe even harmless that the Mormons would be interested in ufology. I mean, certainly an argument could be made that Mormonism is the OG American ancient astronaut religion. It did come out of that whole milieu, that kind of occult revival in the 19th century. But on the flip side of the coin, the Mormons have had a long, especially in the recent years, in the Cold War era, very close association with a lot of far-right groups. Bob Gritz, certainly the big ex-Green Beret who became a major spokesman for the militia culture during the 90s and onwards. Bo Gritz is a Mormon. Glenn Beck is a Mormon. Ezra Taft Benson, who was a major figure in kind of emerging in the lines with the John Birch Society, had been a Mormon elder. Gosh, I'm trying to think of some of the more prevalent. Oh, yes, Skousen's, W. Cleon Skousen, the author of The Naked Capitalist and some of these other things. And then more recently, there's connections with the Oath Keepers as well. So, I mean, I think especially within, certain branches of Mormonism, there has been this, longstanding interest in this kind of paramilitary militia culture. Another kind of dark example of that would be, some of the members of the order. I know Robert J. Matthews, who was the founder of it. The Order, for those of you who are not familiar, was a right-wing terror group from the 1980s. They engaged in a series of bank robberies. They assassinated Alan Berg, a few other things. But Robert J. Matthews was brought up in a Mormon family. Israel Keyes, the serial killer, had also been brought up in a Mormon family, a fundamentalist Mormon family that had ties later to Christian identity, and some of these paramilitary circles like Chevy Kehoe and those types of people. So there has been this association with especially this militia culture in some of the fundamentalist Mormon sects and some of the more fringe elements of the mainline LDS. And, to some extent, I think that did provide an avenue for some of this radical ideology to creep in to the New Age circles and the UFO circles. I mean, you kind of see that with the Nazara movement that's become really big in QAnon. And again, sort of the origins from that, again, came from a lot of, ex-Mormons who are promoting it in Utah.
So can you explain more about that? Because I've not heard about that.
Well, the Nazara thing, oh God, it's so silly. It's essentially, it's almost like another sort of version of like the sovereign citizen thing where you don't have to pay taxes and that type of stuff. And I think we're going to have like a a debt jubilee or just all this other sort of absurdity. But yeah, no, it was picked up big on QAnon. And I mean, now you've kind of seen a lot of people like David Troy and what have you arguing that it was sort of an early basis for some of the mythos. I mean, it does kind of have that, going back to the late 90s, the whole thing with the white hats and the black hats and, that type of thing. So, that's been sort of another thing that's been in the air, I guess, since probably the 1980s, maybe a little after that, and kind of intersected with, I think the sovereign citizen crowd. So, but it seems like in recent years, it's really gained a lot of traction with the internet. Surprise, surprise. Thank God. I think now we're up to the point where we have a Nazera cryptocurrency or something like that. So, but then again, what doesn't have a cryptocurrency nowadays?
Wow. You know what? I do find it interesting that all roads, in my opinions, do seem to lead back to Utah, or, a lot of things have been going on here for quite some time. And yet, I mean, there are incredible people here, faith people that believe in the Mormon faith and are incredible people. And so it's a difficult thing. I don't know. It's like any religion. You have corrupt people in the religion and people that are, I don't know. Anyway, yeah. So I do, anyway, I'm kind of stumbling because I'm just, yeah, I'm actually Mormon, LDS.
Yeah, I know
Which,
that's a bit of a delicate situation for you.
yeah, no, it is interesting. So, I mean, what do you think, though? Let's talk about skinwalkers at the Pentagon, because to me, you've got this new book that's coming out, and again, you've got the same players involved with one new player that's added to this, but again, they're like giving out information without a lot of factual data to back it up. So, what do you think, Stephen, about all of this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's certainly interesting that they did come out with the Skinwalker thing, and I mean, are essentially trying to argue that Skinwalker Ranch really was the whole basis for the Pentagon's, later UFO research program. And then what it was like, they brought essentially the DIA scientist out the Skinwalker for 2 days, and he came back convinced that they needed to sponsor the program. So it definitely raises the real questions about what exactly happened there. Obviously it made quite an impression. There's been a lot of rumblings for years that, I mean, Skinwalker was being used to test, I mean, non-lethal weapons or that type of thing. I mean, certainly a lot of the figures involved with NIDS and later BASS did have that kind of background. I've looked into a lot as to whether or not there was a prehistory of paranormal phenomenon specifically at the ranch. That's definitely very debatable. It does seem like to some extent it was almost an experiment to see if you could create a window area to some extent. At least that's sort of how I read it. That's not entirely without precedent, at least in terms of some of the paranormal field. I think it was like the Sorod experiments or something like that, where they had essentially tried to create, a ghost more or less to see that they could communicate with it. And also the Phillips experiment as well, for that matter. So, this is something that had been toyed with in parapsychology circles for a long time. And, if a guy like Big O was willing to foot the bill to really do some in-depth, studies on that, I think there might have been some people willing to sign up and give it a try. But the things that went on at Skinwalker, I mean, it's shrouded in mystery, to put it mildly. Who knows? We may never know what exactly happened there. I mean, whether or not it was just a continuation of some of this disinformation that's been going on for years, whether it was real, research that was being done there. I mean, I think with a lot of this stuff, it was probably a combination of the two. But yeah, it's clearly at the heart of a lot of the stuff that the government has been looking at, no doubt. And yeah, it does make it kind of interesting now that, I mean, it's got its own, TV show and what have you.
I think the thing for me that's been so interesting over the years is, the fact that I've got, I mean, I could show you. I've showed all of you on different shows the stack of pages that I have, hundreds of pages of the Bass reports, and there's literally nothing going on. It is literally, oh, nothing to report. Here's the weather. I'm going to the gate. Here's a license plate number of a car. I mean, it's like, okay, you've got all of this alleged research taking place, and yet there are no cameras there. The cameras that are there are by the admission of some people there were fake cameras, just to dummy cameras to put up there. The one camera that could have caught something was, the wires were cut, and allegedly this was a paranormal thing, according to some of the people at NIDS. But by the account of Junior Hicks, who was the electrician who went in to fix that, he said they were cut by, this was a man-made thing. This was something that was done. And so you look at all of this and you just think, why do this? Is what is the end game? This is obviously looks like, you've got this story, Skinwalker Ranch, Hunt for the Skinwalker, inserted into the narrative by Kelleher and by Bigelow and George Knapp. And then all of a sudden, here we've got this place where you've got Skinwalker Ridge and all of these things, and yet nobody's talking about the fact that, well, wait a minute, the Skinwalker is Navajo. It's not Ute. I mean, and why would that be taking place in this area? It is
Yeah.
it's fascinating to me, and the fact that we've got this top secret program. We're looking for UAP, and we are doing all of this paranormal testing, but yet we're going to let everybody on the planet know about it. I mean, none of these things add up. And so I'm trying to get to the point where, is this a grift? Is this what are they doing? Is this a rogue group of people who have just conned the government out of $22 million? Or is this something that is taking place where they are testing non-lethal weapons? What is it? Because it very clearly is not studying UFOs.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and the amount of funding, though, I mean, even then is just sort of strange because, I mean, in this day and age, I mean, $22 million, I mean, is, probably barely enough to buy like a decent handicap, ramp or something like that. A lot of federal buildings in DC. I mean, I'm being a little facetious there, but I mean, $22 million doesn't buy what it used to. Let's just put it that way. And yeah, you would sort of think if it was a grift, Robert Bigelow could have come up with like something that would have generated more money than that. I mean,
But
the
you're
guy,
assuming that it was just that.
yes,
When
and
there
that,
could be,
and that also, it kind of begs the question though, too, how much of it was also the marketing and merchandising, I mean, associated with it as well. I mean, it's
marketing
possible.
and merchandising, different land deals, and I think there's probably a lot more to that.
But the thing that's interesting to me about that is I think what was it? The Hunt for the Skinwalker came out in 2005, right?
Oh God, I've tried to go to therapy to get over when it came out, but yeah, you're probably right.
I think it's like right around that time. And see, this was like right around the same time that the Serpo stuff kind of kicked off too, which is interesting. I mean, it really got going, I think, in like November of 2005. So this was probably a little after like the Skinwalker thing had come out. And then of course, there was the flap when it started to come out that it seemed like Doty had actually been the one who had fabricated all of the stuff with the request anonymous messages and so forth. But this is, essentially concurrently, like right around the time I think that they would have, maybe a little afterwards, but they would have been bringing the DIA agent in there to sort of look at Skinwalker. And then the funding gets greenlit in 07 and things get going in 08. So it's kind of interesting that, in between this stuff where they have NIDS and then Bass, and it's like they're doing this legitimate scientific research with Bigelow, and then later on the Pentagon's dime, they just sort of embark upon this whole bizarre thing with Serpo, where it's like, yes, there's this alien exchange program, and they like fried ice cream or something like that. And I'm still trying to.
But go back to legitimate research with NIDS.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that they were doing legitimate research.
Okay,
But
I just thank you for clarifying.
at least though with NIDS, I mean, it looked like they were doing something serious. Like Serpo just is cartoonish. I mean, everything about it is like silly. You know what I mean? It's just. I'm still baffled, like how they went from like the NIDS thing to just sort of this, weird thing with like Serpo, where it's like, yeah, we're gonna come out and bring out this trope again with the red and the yellow book and talk about the crystal and how Doty couldn't trigger it because he didn't have the right, alien DNA. And just I mean, sometimes you almost wonder if they do that deliberately just to sort of clue people in on the joke or something to see if anybody gets it.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing. It's like if you're thinking that you're going to take any of these people seriously, and then you go back and you look at the history and what they've done. I mean, I'm sure that I am sure that those guys sit down at a dinner table and have a couple glasses of wine and just say, look at this group of fools. I mean, really, who is buying this time and time again. Yet we're going to say that, we've got this information, but we're going to dangle a carrot over here, and then we're going to pull it back, and then we're going to release this and pull it back. And honestly, if people were really on the verge of studying reverse technology, do you think we would have this disclosure like this? I mean, there's so many questions about all of this. It just is a kind of a, I don't know.
Well,
It's
I mean, to put another thing in with the Serpo stuff that even further enhances the absurdity, it's the whole thing kind of related to the association of former intelligence officers and this character James Angleton Jr., who claimed to be the grandson of the legendary James Jesus Angleton, the longtime CIA counterintelligence chief. If you've seen The Good Shepherd, the Matt Damon character was based on Angleton. He's definitely very much a legend in intelligence circles. So anyway, around the late 90s, this guy who alleged to be his grandson set up a Miami-based chapter of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers and claimed that he had all of these documents that his grandfather had left over that, revealed the existence of the secret UFO program and the government and how Angleton was a part of it and all this other stuff. And I mean, they actually got put off to go down there and I think give a speech to that Miami chapter of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers.
Actually got him to, or did he volunteer?
I don't know if he
Or did he set
volunteered
it
or
up?
not, but it's possible. But I mean, they later used this stuff from Angleton Jr., like in the book that Robert Collins and Doty wrote, Exempt from Disclosure. I mean, there's a whole section on that. So anyway, some people finally started to look into this, and it turns out that basically it was all a hoax. Angleton Jr. was not related in any way to James Jesus Angleton. In fact, they were able to track down members of James Jesus Angleton's family who said that they, had never heard of this guy. So he was all a LARP. Okay. So Putoff could not tell that this James Angleton Jr. guy was a grifter / con man running this, chapter in Miami, but he's able to do the 0 point energy and reverse engineer, alien technology and lead, the To the Stars Academy for this US UFO disclosure thing. That doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. But I mean, from what I understand, that's Angleton is not the only guy in the Association of Former Intelligence Officers who was a con man. In fact, it seems like a good chunk of the membership in the Association of Former Intelligence Officers are a lot of these frickin' LARPers. And they're in there with a lot of other interesting people like Colonel Michael Aquino, people like John Alexander, people like Peter Levenda.
So let's talk about Michael Aquino. Give us a little bit of background on Aquino.
Well, Aquino was another one of these sort of dubious characters. He was an Army officer, made it up to the rank of colonel with a specialty in psychological warfare. If you watched any amount of talk shows during the 1980s, you probably saw him there in his theatrical getup with a cape and his plucked eyebrows, talking about peace, love, and understanding for Satanism.
I don't think those were plucked. There was something. They were not plucked. I mean, my God, I think he had hair plugs for eyebrows. There was something. Anyway,
eyebrow extensions. Yes, something like
was
that.
carefully coiffed.
It was high camp, to put it mildly. Obviously, Aquino is most known for the allegations surrounding him from Presidio. There's been a lot of rumors for years that he was a pedophile, that there was some kind of ritualistic abuse of children in the 1980s that he was involved with. Those allegations are controversial. I'm kind of on the fence with those myself, but I don't know if you can ever really discount anything as far as Michael Aquino is concerned. He was a member of the Church of Satan, which he had signed up for in the late 1960s, but he eventually decided that LaVey just wasn't serious enough as far as the satanic principles went, so he founded the Temple of Set around the mid 1970s. It might have been a little earlier than that, but regardless, Aquino was certainly a bit of a visionary in occult circles, specifically in I think it was the Satanic Verses, which was the second kind of metaphysical book that LaVey had come out with after the the Satanic Bible. But the Satanic Verses had a ritual in it called the Order, or the something of the Nine Angles. I can't remember the beginning of it. But as far as I know, this was the first time you saw the reference to Nine Angles. Of course, this later became a secret society / terror outfit. They don't appear to have a direct connection with Aquino, though they did exchange some correspondences with Aquino during the 90s. But it is interesting. He was doing rituals based on that. And Aquino was also one of the early advocates of incorporating Lovecraft's whole pantheon into these magical rituals. I kind of refer to this as the Lovecraft mythos, but a lot of other occultists would take this up in the 70s. Kenneth Grant was a big one. Peter Levenda was another guy who became obsessed with this kind of stuff. Well, we don't know technically if Levenda did. Simon, who wrote the Simon Necronomicon, who was... Some people think that's Levenda. Some people think that's a pseudonym for a group of researchers that Levenda was a part of. Levenda insists that Simon is a real person that he knew in the 70s and is in contact with. So, again, it's another one of the great mysteries involved with that. But Aquino was another guy who was trying to circulate these mythos in the 70s. And, again, that's really interesting because Lovecraft's deities were essentially these, space gods, more or less, that had given birth to humanity and effectively wanted to destroy it many eons ago. So that's another strange component to all this.
Thank you for showing that photo. That's, you can't. What else can you say? I don't know. I've seen a lot of nerdy men in their 70s and 80s, and clearly they could do some sort of eyebrow wax. He did that. He was very good. Yes. Well.
So yeah, he's he was something else. He claimed that he first met John Alexander through the Association of Former Intelligence Officers around the early noughts, I think, and it seemed like they had become a bit of bosom buddies since then. Both Aquino and Alexander would get their own little forums on Above Top Secret, where they would go and exchange messages during the last decade. That's kind of another interesting thing because Above Top Secret was also used to spread the whole Serpo thing during the process.
And so let's talk about Above Top Secret because that's certainly seems there's a lot of strange things going on and a lot of strange stories about Above Top Secret. And it was really interesting in Jeremy Corbell's movie documentary about Skinwalker Ranch, where it was. I'm not actually really don't know what that was, but there was a fire scene when you're looking at all of them and their crotches and they're talking about drinking a beer and smoking a cigarette. And
glad I didn't see it.
You know what? You should be, because I'm not quite sure what it that had to do with Skinwalker Ranch, but you've got the fellow that was involved with the Above Top Secret, and Robbie Williams, who are just conveniently there for a fireside chat about the paranormal goings-ons of Skinwalker Ranch. And so what what is the deal with Above Top Secret? Where did it start? The origins? Who are the people that promoted things on Above Top Secret?
Well, I think it started out like the late 90s, early noughts or something like that. And it was kind of interesting because there were some sites not directly related to Above Top Secret, but had been started. I think it might have been by one of the co-founders that had promoted the Majestic ARG back in around 2001 or so. And an ARG is an alternate reality game. Majestic was one of the very first commercial ones, and alternate reality games have been in the news a lot lately because there is a lot of compelling evidence that QAnon was an alternate reality game. Serpo probably was one as well. So it's really interesting that you see that connection with Above Top Secret early in the game, and then later on, Above Top Secret would also play a large role, as I had alluded to earlier, in launching the Serpo thing in 2005. So there is that kind of interesting connection. There's been a lot of rumors for years that Aviary members had stock in Above Top Secret. Certainly, you've had the presence of at least one in Alexander with his own forum there. There's been rumors that they also use it with various sock puppets and so forth to spread narratives into the UFO field as well. So,
what type of sock puppets would be spreading information into the UFO field?
That would be more of a discussion for our mutual friend. He's the one who chronicles the sock puppets. So I don't want to start singling out specific ones. That's definitely not my field of expertise. But it is, again, interesting to point out just how similar this is to the QAnon thing and 4chan and 8chan. Again, with Serpo, I mean, it was really crucial with how it was spread on Above Top Secret, and then later Open Minds forum, which is where they really kind of built up a lot of the mythos with commentators and so forth. And this is the same thing that was done in 4chan and 8chan with the so-called bakers and so forth. And of course, with Serpo, I mean, that later led to Project Camelot as an outgrowth of that, and then Project Avalon, with the QAnon thing. I mean, you got like Patriot Soapbox eventually and that type of stuff. Though, in fairness, they did denounce all of the Q stuff eventually when they found out what was going on with Corsi and some of these other characters. But again, it's just interesting how you see that use of internet personalities, of influencers, to build up sort of this mythos online, which is why, I mean, I think the Serpo stuff is really important when you're sort of trying to analyze what later happened with Q. I mean, you can almost sort of see the UFO community as kind of a beta test for how it could be done to the broader public later on. And I mean, it's even down to just how, like in November 2005, I mean, Serpo got a big boost when I think it was Whitley Strieber who went on to Coast to him and had mentioned that he could vaguely recall some reference to Serpo. And it was, similar. I mean, with Q in 2017, I think it was in either November or December that year. I mean, there was the appearance on InfoWar with Baruch the Scribe, where they boosted Q, and that was, again, I think probably crucial, setting up these narratives and getting Jerome Corsi to go on there and boost it. So again, it's just sort of the same kind of approach to these internet influencers, and then other people working with these internet sock puppets and so forth. I mean, there was a lot of that in Q as well. And more ominously, there's also the component of trolling and internet harassment and so forth. Certainly the people who had tried to expose Serpo initially going back into 07, 08, they were doxxed, they were harassed horribly in some of these forums.
So can you talk about who those people were and what happened specifically?
Again, I don't want to get into this too much out of privacy, but again, there were definitely some commentators who had done some excellent research into that. There was, Titus, I think, was the sort of the guy who had tried to expose it originally as one of the posters. And then, you kind of got into that whole circle too with that lawyer from MUFON as well, who became involved with it. But
not Denny Sheehan.
No, not
Okay.
him. I don't want to say too much on that right now because I
Okay.
don't recall the
Okay.
names off the top of my head. But yeah, there was a group of researchers from sort of early on who I think became aware that SERPA was a kind of alternate reality game, and were trying to put pressure on the Aviary to come clean on that. There was the whole chain of emails that was leaked out about it. And that's another thing where there's these eerie parallels to the Q thing, because there was sort of, allegedly this, group of 5 that was evaluating the Serpo stuff, which included a couple of the Aviary people, and they should have been aware that the email chain had been compromised early on, because they were bringing in people into the email chain who they suspected of sending them these threatening emails to out them. So it's just like, why would you even do this and then start sending them emails? So it almost seems like they were doing this deliberately because they knew the emails were going to be leaked. And this was the same thing with Q. I spoke to one of the people who were involved with one of the major architects of it, and they told me that they had literally received thousands of emails from this individual. I mean, they had like a whole account that was just full of emails from them. And in hindsight, their suspicion is because they thought that they wanted these emails to leak,
Well, it's
because
like,
it was being used to construct a narrative.
right. And you get on Jack Sarfati's email list and you're doomed.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
it's like,
Sarfati's like another one. I think, again,
Yeah.
he knows this stuff is going to
Oh,
come out. I mean, again, he's using it to construct a narrative.
right.
So, there's just so many of these techniques that you later see in Q that, have been used in the UFO community for a lot of years. It's such, a fascinating appropriation of these methods and what they've been done on a massive scale. And I mean, with some of the stuff that, people like Cambridge Analytica had developed.
And
So
that is,
Steve, do you think that they specifically target the UFO community to do these tests before they move out into other areas?
Well, again, that's something it's hard to say. I don't really want to say for sure one way or the other. Is it something where this was a deliberately sort of a test run, or was it something where individuals who later became involved in the Q thing were aware of what had been done in the UFO community and were saying, well, obviously this stuff worked. Why don't we see what we can do with it? And I mean, we may never really know that for sure. I mean, I doubt that anybody would have left a paper trail with that. But I mean, when you look at some of the connections, and, specifically with MUFON, I mean, that's really another kind of red flag. But I mean, MUFON was involved, and this is something Skinwalker at the Pentagon really laid bare. MUFON was being subcontracted by Bass, through all this stuff with the Pentagon and what have you. And I think that's significant, because you later see at least one guy, Frank Bacon. That's not his real name, but we'll just go with that for now. That's kind of his internet handle, who is the son of a prominent MUFON figure, and who also had involvement with MUFON. And he was a guy who was active in a lot of this stuff with Q. I mean, he appears to have known, John McAfee, and was involved in some of this other stuff with cryptocurrencies and what have you as well. So, there's this just weird component to that. And there is this MUFON linkage that ties in with Bass and all this other stuff. So you can look at the Q people, and I mean, there's other connections as well, and say, they definitely had kind of traveled in a lot of the same circles with some of these UFO people. So maybe, I mean, it was a deliberate continuation of the operation of what was being done in the UFO field. As I said before, it's just possible that they were aware of some of the things that were being done in the UFO circles and realized that it had applications, to this sort of broader, kind of right-wing Alex Jones conspiracy crowd.
I see.
well, and that's what I think. I think it's really interesting. I've mentioned this on my show before, but you look back at Area 2000, which was, the first show that Bigelow funded, I think ran for 6 months. And that was like a precursor to, Coast to Coast and things like that. And he brought in Linda Moulton Howe and John Alexander and, George Knapp, and this kind of, the same old people. And apparently, from what I understand, I think Amy Collins, who's in chat, told me this. I think the first episode that they did was John Alexander talking about UFOs and non-lethal weapons. And so it's just fascinating to me to see how this certain group has used the same people over and over to portray or to get into the minds of people who might distrust the government. You're listening to Coast AM late at night. You're driving a truck across the country. You're, I mean, everybody has their own story, but it gets into you. They've got this hook, and then you're feeling like I'm the last person out. And I should distrust the government. I shouldn't, trust anything that they're saying about health and wellness, that I have my own ability to heal myself. I've got, all of these things. And then you bring in, the UFO narrative and the fact that, oh, you've got the tall, benevolent space brothers who are clearly blonde-eyed, blue-eyed and blonde-haired, and these things that go right along with that Nazi ideology. And you've got other things that are just so, I don't know, disturbing in all of this. It's like, grab your guns, distrust the government, UFOs are coming, the apocalypse is coming. And it is really, in my opinion, when you look at all of this, and then you look at Coast to Coast AM, who has continually brought on people who are like Stuart Rhodes, the head of the Oath Keepers, time and time again, or Roger Stone, or Michael Flynn. And I hate to get too political because I've had enough of, I don't know, all of this stuff. But I do think that is an important thing to bring up. It's like, what does that have to do with UFO research? What does that have to do with paranormal research? It really doesn't. But these people are using paranormal UFOs to completely, I believe, corrupt a whole group of people.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's been, really like an ongoing process as well. Probably at least going back. I mean, I think to the days of like Task Force Delta, where I was kind of saying, you see people like Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was such a big figure in the New Age circles and so forth, kind of being brought into this, kind of network with all of these military officers and what have you. And I mean, it's interesting in general because, I mean, I think it's, kind of going back to that whole era, prior to that in the 1970s, to put this in perspective, I mean, that was obviously kind of a rough time for the United States. There was a lot of unpopularity with the Vietnam War. A lot of the other revelations about Watergate and some of the other scandals were starting to come out. And, I think they needed a way to start to rebrand some of this stuff. That's one of the reasons why I find the fundamental physics group, for instance, to be so interesting, which really sort of started to take off around the mid 1970s. Because again, in the early 70s, physics was just seen as the absolute, ultimate personification of defense science. These were the people who were just a crucial part of building, the nuclear weapons and all of this other advanced military technology. And the anti-war movement knew this. And as a result of that, physics buildings were literally being bombed across college campuses in the late 60s and the early 1970s. People were, dropping out of the field because they didn't want to be a part of the military industrial complex. Okay. So then you have this situation in the mid 1970s where the fundamental physics group starts to get a lot of press, and eventually it's the Tao of physics come out, and the Dancing Wu Masters, and suddenly physics, they start pushing this quantum physics stuff, which rebrands it. And it now has this sort of woo-woo hippified version of it about how, we're trying to understand the mysteries of the universe. And, by the way, help us come up with quantum computing, because that will be the future when it comes to digital espionage. But, we won't talk about that because it's also going to help us breach another dimension where the fairy people are. But, yeah, I think a lot of this kind of stuff, was a really elaborate way to sort of rebrand some of this. And it also introduced an opening for the military industrial complex to, kind of get into the anti-war movement through, a lot of this sort of new age spirituality that was starting to come out and really dominate in the 1970s. And also, just more broadly speaking, it was a way, I think, to get people out of political activism in general. I mean, that's kind of another thing that's not really talked about a lot. But I mean, in the 60s, you really did have this sort of distinct movements with the New Left, which was very, anti-war, which was very pro-civil rights, which was very deeply involved in activism. And then you had the counterculture, which was really more of the drug stuff, kind of head politics, quote unquote. And this, eventually sort of morphed into the consciousness movement in the 1970s. And I mean, as a lot of these people sort of would tell you, they were apolitical. They were more concerned with inner space than what was going on in the real world. And I think as a result of that, you did see a lot of people start to gradually abandon political activism in the 1970s and especially about the 1980s. It kind of gave rise to the whole, notion of the me generation and so forth, and personal gratification, really, and self-improvement and what have you. I mean, it really is just sort of interesting when you kind of look at what kind of became known as the Aquarian conspiracy about the late 70s, early 1980s. If you go back and read Marilyn Ferguson's book about this, when she gets into talking about the group's political ideology, she describes it as quote unquote radical centralism with an emphasis on deregulation. Getting the government out of everybody's hair and that type of thing. I mean, basically, it's a kind of left-wing version of libertarianism, more or less, which nobody ever even really talks about anymore. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a way, really, I think, to try to diffuse a lot of this anti-war activism, civil rights movement, a lot of the other stuff that had become so big in the 1960s. And that was probably another, component about this that, kind of plays into the psychological warfare elements that we've been talking about earlier.
And I think it's really interesting, too, when you go back to the late 60s and you look at Dr. James McDonald, who was, Anne Druffel wrote the book Firestorm about Dr. James McDonald, but Dr. James McDonald's wife was involved with the Black Panthers, and there were some things going on at that time where they felt that they were being followed by people, and that have been, I think some of that was attributed to his work in UFOs, but could that have been attributed to, the family, or specifically his wife's ties to some of these movements that would be radical in the eyes of the government?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I mean, again, it's just, and I mean, this is something that was really hard for me to come to terms with in researching a lot of this stuff, because I mean, I would definitely say that, I mean, a lot of like my worldview was shaped very heavily by things like Robert Anton Wilson and Discordianism and so forth. And, I mean, I definitely would describe myself as someone with a long time interested in consciousness and a lot of this kind of, I mean, kind of woo-woo research and what have you as well. But I mean, I do think, in hindsight, I mean, you have to, kind of realize that, I mean, you also have to engage in the real world and the here and now. And, frankly, also, I mean, I think ultimately, I mean, a lot of this, was just stuff that kind of gave privileged white people a way to, justify their comfort and so forth. Because it was all due to their mental well-being, because they were focused on positive things in life, and by just trying to go out and put good vibrations in the universe or something like that, that could take the place of actual activism, so that's, to me, it's very problematic. And I mean, I think it's still an ongoing problem in the left to this day. Well, I mean, obviously in this day and age, I mean, it's become really warped. I mean, even more so now by the right, and the kind of return of the whole power of positive thinking and this type of thing. I mean, obviously this was something that the New Age has been enamored with for years. Obviously, I mean, in recent years, it's been referred to as the secret, but I mean, this has been kind of present in that type of ideology for a long time, the law of attractions, all this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's just, again, this sort of emphasis on magical thinking, I think, over real world activism. And I think as the right has kind of shown, I mean, you need a combination of both to be successful.
And, isn't that, it is, I don't know. I mean, I look at the power of positive thinking. I mean, you look at, all of these books, Esther Hicks, and the law of attraction and all of these things where, I mean, it was really, she was channeling something, Ramtha. I mean, that's always a great example of a channeler. Oh my God. But, it's like, to me, it is in one sense very sad, because I do believe that we have the ability to create our reality. If we focus on something, we can make it happen. And I think that unfortunately, that has been, our own personal power has been hijacked by some of these people, some of these groups, these factions, and that's really unfortunate to me. And I think I know that there are good people out there who are turning to different places to get information and to be almost in a way like led. It's like, you're going into a yoga class and you find a master, a yoga master, and it's somebody that you can follow, but that person has a lot of failings and could be corrupt. And it's just sad how many times and places that we can look for leadership, and because we are, I don't know what, we can be molded, we are taken down a path that isn't in our best interest. And I think at the end of the day, like, personal power is the most important thing. I know this sounds, I'm going on a lot of different tangents, but I think at the end of the day, if you've had a personal sighting or a paranormal experience, hold on to that. Don't look to anybody else to give you information about that, because there's so many ways where you can be entrapped and that personal power can be taken away from you.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, that's the thing a lot of these groups do is, I mean, they do manipulate people in that fashion, because it's, I mean, obviously it's hard in general to find people to even talk to about those kinds of experiences in the first place. And, a lot of these spooks, the flesh and blood ones, I should say, not the metaphysical ones, but, they are aware of this. And I mean, they know the people who have had these kinds of experiences are psychologically vulnerable, and they take advantage of that. That's a very sad reality of all of this. One of the more tragic ones, honestly.
And so, I mean, who do you think are some of the major culprits in manipulating people like that?
Well, I mean, you don't really like to necessarily name names outright, but there have been some people who have certainly, I would say, yeah, taken some advantage of people over the years for various methods. All right, well, let's just go with one who's currently dead now, and who doesn't really get, I think, nearly as much criticism as he deserves, and that's Kenneth Grant. Kenneth Grant, for those of you who are not familiar, was a protege of Aleister Crowley, though he has developed his own unique system, the Typhonian tradition, as he would refer to it as, and had an ongoing rivalry with the American branch of the OTO. But Grant was a guy who really pushed, I think, a lot of this, Lovecraft, gnosis that I was alluding to earlier. I mean, almost all of the major accolades of this kind of stuff had ties to Grant and his magical system. And I mean, usually were promoted by Grant himself in his different books. I mean, of course, famously, he promoted the Simon Necronomicon. There was the Bait Cabal from the area around Ohio and Cincinnati and so forth that he later promoted. And more recently, Mr. Peter Levenda has broken out again. Some of the stuff with Jeffrey Evans, who is certainly an interesting figure as well, who Grant later promoted and also tied into all this stuff with the Typhonian tradition. But Grant, is a really sketchy character. His whole system is basically centered around this notion of accessing the night side tree of life, which is where the Lovecraftian space gods apparently reside. And the first thing about this that, you have to really wonder is, why would anyone want to create a magical system based around Cthulhu in the first place? I mean, seriously, of all the things that you would want to usher into the world, why the freaking Lovecraftian old ones of all things? You're basically saying, well, we want to try to create a religion around entities whose sole, I shouldn't say sole purpose, but I mean, they're, one of their ongoing preoccupations is destroy humanity, because they can. Just because they can. Okay, so like, why would you want a magical system based on this in the first place? But anyway, this has been an ongoing process, I mean, for a while now. And I mean, you've seen just elements of this seeding into the popular culture. Probably one of the most noteworthy examples would be the first Ghostbusters movie, which incorporated elements of the Simon Necronomicon into it and so forth. So, Grant was promoting this sort of weird worldview for a lot of years. And I mean, I think that as time has gone on, I mean, this has just become a really warped ideology. And I mean, you're starting to see it become so mainstream now with how much, I mean, traction that Lovecraft has gained. And certainly, I mean, I think that this is pushing people into some very dark places, to put it mildly. I mean, in a way, it's like I said, you're almost trying to come up with a system based on the most heinous, insidious things you could possibly imagine. And I mean, now, I mean, I think some of this has been brought into things like the Order of the Nine Angles and so forth. So, I mean, it's almost creating this just monstrous magical system to see that if you can, essentially, and to see what will come through with it. And then trying to rationalize it, essentially. So, yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that, when you look at some of this ideology that's being promoted, and then, I mean, of course, with Aquino's own promotion of Satanism, and then later the Temple of Set, it does seem like that there is this attempt to try to come up with these occult systems that are very much centered around just this very hideous, ideology, and then promoting them to the public at large. And I mean, getting people to seek out this kind of stuff. I mean, with the Simon Necronomicon, I mean, it's probably the best-selling grimoire that's ever been written. There are a lot of accounts of people, I mean, having breakdowns from having used it. There was the one, what was it, the vampire cult from Kentucky or something like that had used it as one of their sort of cornerstones. So, it's just, again, it's one of these things that is just amazing to me. That you see this stuff done openly. And I mean, when I think, when you look at a lot of the things that are happening in the modern world now, I mean, I do think it's, I mean, a result to some extent from just possession, honestly. I mean, I think that's sort of the missing component, when you look at the things like Cambridge Analytica, that nobody's really kind of addressing. But, again, to kind of return to the person that we started with, talking about Chris Knowles and the Secret Sun. Chris has done a lot of great work on this, about how effectively, we are being manipulated by a form of sorcery now. And I mean, I think ultimately that's what psychological warfare is. And when you look at what has happened with people that have fallen into the stuff with QAnon, I mean, I do think that you have to equate it with the kind of possession ultimately. It's having just a traumatic effect on certain individuals. I mean, to the extent that what you had the one Q follower that murdered a freaking, mafia capo in New York a couple of years ago, and some of these other incidents that have played out. This is, to me, this is the very essence of possession, if you really want to get down to it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's also, I mean, there's so many layers to this, and that's what I love about your work, Stephen, is that you go in there and you're looking back to the past. You're looking at all the players involved, and you're looking at the political motivations and the finances and a bigger picture, which, again, I will say we don't do in the UFO world. And I think that's been one thing I've learned the hard way, is this isn't just about a single person who's coming forward that we should try to discredit. This is about, I mean, there's a large structure, a large organization or organizations involved in pulling the strings. And that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. I'm fairly sure that all of this can be backed up with the research that you've done with other people. And it's alarming to me to see what's taking place. So I appreciate your work, Stephen.
Well, thank you. And I mean, yeah, and it's, there is this sort of wide network, but I mean, I think, again, we also, I mean, again, I don't always mean to kind of go back on mystical kind of stuff with this, but I mean, there's just so many things with the synchronicities and so forth that, I don't know that you can necessarily reduce to just a conspiracy. I mean, a good example of that would just be the Kennedy assassination. I mean, I think the thing that just blows so many people's minds about the Kennedy assassination is how just almost every figure you could possibly imagine shows up in it, along with all this other stuff. I mean, you have like the Nine showing up in the Kennedy assassination. You have all of these secret societies. You have connections to people like Tom Slick, the famous cryptozoologist from the Bush family, and what have you. And at some point, I mean, you just have to realize that it couldn't even be an organized conspiracy to have all of these players and all of these figures like turning up in it, which just kind of makes you wonder, well, what is going on here? Why does it seem like that there are these certain historical events that are a lightning rod for all of these individuals, for all this high weirdness that plays out in it? That is sort of, I think, the missing component to all of this. And I mean, that's where, again, you kind of go back to the Aviary, and I mean, whether or not, they were actually directing a conspiracy, to be honest, I mean, I increasingly lean towards the opinion that they have gone mad to some extent, trying to discern, their own reality. And I mean, what is driving all of this? Was there a control group?
Funding.
Yeah.
Funding. I don't know. Who knows what it is? But at the end of the day, I mean, what do you think about, put off, Green, all of these people? I mean, what is their motivation? I mean, obviously they've been, as you have mentioned, for the past couple hours, they've been involved in some of the greatest hoaxes in ufology. And so what is the motivation when clearly for me, the motivation has never been bringing truth to the subject?
Yeah, I mean, I almost, to some extent think they see this as a kind of magical working. I mean, there's obviously the financial component to it, but I mean, do they still need to continue to do this as they get into their 80s? I mean, it seems like they have become fairly comfortable with some of the different posts that they've held over the years. I mean, there does seem to be something driving them beyond, I think, at this point, just simply financial gain. Again, there is that sort of strange element to all of this. And I mean, when you look at just, some of the theories of Jacques Vallée, I mean, some of these other guys, I mean, I do think that there is this sort of odd spiritual component that drives them in some sense. I think in the case of maybe some of the other individuals, it is, I mean, a more materialistic aspiration. But I mean, it does seem like there is a bit of a difference between what they've tried to accomplish versus David Wilcox, for instance, or Corey Good, where this is where you're getting into just full blown, confidence schemes. And
I mean, and that it in and of itself is puppet show material. Which, but then again, what are the connections when Corey Good is the first person to leak specific information with regard to the 38 Dirds? And I mean, just like all of this stuff, it's like why are these people? All of these people seem to be involved, and there seems to be a prime source, and I mean, these prime sources are put off Bigelow and things over the years. And so what is that about? I don't know. But I think that at the end of the day, nothing good has come out of that. There's never been a disclosure. It's been fooling people and making money and steering a narrative. And I don't know. I think, at the end of the day, these people, either it's a grift or this is an intelligence operation. There's something going on that is not right, in my opinion, with all of these people.
well, the other thing too, though, that you have to sort of consider is, I mean, the component with the Russians and a lot of this as well. Because I mean, the Russians definitely, I mean, as I kind of was getting into earlier, I mean, also have their own sort of obsession with a lot of this as well. I mean, that's kind of the other thing that I find fascinating is how, on both sides of the Cold War divide, you sort of had like these different intelligence officers who were promoting these sort of arcane ideologies. And I mean, there was, in some cases, some rather obvious overlap. What was his name? Stanislav Graf, I think.
Yeah, yep.
I mean, he was a guy who had done, some of these, LSD experiments, and I think it was Czechoslovakia in the 60s that were being sponsored by like the KGB. And then he just ends up over here in the United States towards the ends of the decade, early 70s, ingrained with like the New Age community. And then, there's the other thing too about LSD that's not really talked about, but most of the LSD that was coming into the United States after 1968 was coming from the Soviet Union. And it was being directed, from what's his name, Robert Haley Stark, who had become involved with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and then later, what was it, the group in the UK? I can't remember their name now, but Stark, he was another guy. He seemed to have connections to some of these right-wing fascist elements in Italy. He possibly had ties to Charles Manson, and certainly he seems to have had ties to the U.S. intelligence community. In fact, he was released from a prison in Italy in 1980 after he was implicated in some of the Gladio terrorism there on the basis that he had been working in the employment of the U.S. intelligence services since the 1970s or something like that. But Stark was bringing all of this LSD into the West that was from the Soviet Union. Okay? So,
Mother of pearl.
yeah. And it's just like they had to have known about this. It was being tolerated. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that just absolutely blows your mind when you get into all of this. I mean, especially when you sort of look at some of the stuff that was happening domestically in the United States by the time with the student revolt and what have you. But at least there were some elements in the U.S. intelligence community that were willing to tolerate this kind of stuff. It's just incredible.
Well, I mean, on that note,
Yeah.
I need to go pray, meditate. I don't know what, bathe in holy water, like go to the Esalen Institute. Somebody needs to come in to help me learn how to channel and dang. But I mean, if Stephen, you always are, it's so fascinating and you have so much information, and that's been the big thing in chat the whole night. It's like, wow.
You are a fountain of info.
Oh, thank you.
You are. And I mean, it's just like the places that you go, I think, are very, very interesting. And I think they're incredibly important. And I wish people in the UFO community would actually look at some of these deeper things, rabbit holes, pictures, because this isn't just, the UFO community isn't just a UFO community. There are a lot of things at play. And so I appreciate your work. And so where can people find you?
Hold on one second before you say that. So we had a good friend of ours, which I'm not going to mention the name because I just don't want to do that. But this person had their Facebook hacked a couple days ago, and whoever went into this account deleted all the information from only three certain people, and then got back out of Facebook. And this person received a warning that somebody was trying to compromise the account, but they got in there and they did that. So the three people that were deleted from this person's messages were myself, Erica, and another researcher that I won't mention. So do you have an opinion about what do you think would be behind someone doing that?
Are you saying that they deleted like the messages or something like that?
Yes.
That you exchanged? Okay.
Yes, because we were exchanging information through those messages.
Yeah. Then they might have been something in those messages that they didn't want like a record left of or something to that effect.
Yes. So it's very strange.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it could have been that intimidation tactic or something too, but yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah. So, okay. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I'll have to talk to you more about that, Scott. Yeah. So anyway, I appreciate you, Steve, for actually just giving me so much information over the past year that I've known you and things. It's just been a real trip. So I appreciate you going down rabbit holes that most people don't go down, because I think we need to look deeper into a lot of these things. So thank you very, very much. I look forward to having you on the show again. And I will say, please go listen to the show that you had with Jack Brewer and myself. That was a great show about NICAP. Very important. You've also done a lot of work on QAnon. And so I commend you for that. That's a tough subject to try to broach in this political climate. So thank you very much. And so when's your book coming out?
Hopefully early next year. I'm just getting into kind of the final stages of it now. I'm tentatively thinking of calling it Spooks, Birchers, Discordians, The Secret History of Conspiratainment. It's going to cover a lot of the topics we got into this: QAnon, the Aviary, Serpo, MK Ultra, Artichoke, psychological warfare, the Giant Birch Society, all kinds of crazy stuff, even Rosicrucianism. So
And that is a very great thing. I'm just trying to, I look at all of the all of these publications that I have going back to 1966, 65. You look on the back and you've got the Rosicrucians
yeah.
right there.
That's another big one too. Yeah, no, in the Invisible College, Jacques Vallée actually said that it was inspired by Rosicrucian principles.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
interesting. I've heard that theme a lot. So we'll have to
So,
another
Steve,
show.
you have your own podcast too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the Farm Podcast. You can find it at the farmpodcast.com, and it's out every Monday. It's a new show each week with me and usually at least one other guest, and we cover a lot of these kinds of topics.
Nice. Excellent.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Definitely. And thanks Shadowy Spectrums and everybody for getting in there and joining the show, asking great comments in chat, and also supporting the show, UFO Classified. You can go in and pledge your support at ufoclassified.com. Thank you so much, personally, on a personal note, for supporting me, because, as some of you know, I've been through a great deal, and there was a wonderful piece on Fox 13 News about what I've been through with regard to the domestic violence circumstances and other things. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. But if you go in and you can share that information about that, that would be wonderful. But thank you all for supporting UFO Classified. I want to thank Scott Brown. You're amazing. I want to thank Mario and all of the people that get in here every week. I love you guys. I'm here for you. I'm sorry I took last week off, but it won't happen again. So
Nice
I'm
meeting you,
back.
Steve.
Yeah.
Nice meeting you too,
And
Scott.
thank you. You guys have a wonderful evening. Please be safe. And we're going to try to end the broadcast. This could be the seventh sign of the apocalypse right here if I actually do this, and then maybe not show me floundering around after I end the broadcast. Here we go. Pray for me.